And if I were to tell you that there is documented historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth did not die on the cross, as we were taught, that ancient manuscripts, evidence from Roman historians, and apocryphal texts point to a completely different version of the events that allegedly took place on Golgotha. If you've ever felt deeply disturbed listening to the traditional narrative of the crucifixion, if something in your heart told you that there were missing pieces in this story, then your spiritual intuition was right. You are not alone in your doubts. In fact, scientists, historians, and theologians from the world's most prestigious universities have asked the same questions as you. For almost 2,000 years, the Church has based all its teaching on one specific event: the death and resurrection of Christ. But what if this event didn't happen the way we were told? What if the royal version of events was deliberately distorted? Perhaps the version about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was deliberately hidden, as it contradicted the political interests of the Roman Empire and threatened its power. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived in the 1st century and witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, left unique details about Roman crucifixes that few people know about. In his book, Jewish Antiquities, he tells how he himself petitioned the Roman procurator for the salvation of 3 of his friends who had been crucified. When they were removed from the crosses, one of them survived. This indicates that crucifixions did not always lead to instant death, contrary to popular belief. Even more disturbing is the testimony of the Gospel of John, the only one who claims to have been present at the crucifixion. It says that when the soldiers came to break the legs of the crucified, a standard procedure to hasten death, they found that Jesus was already dead. However, here comes the first discrepancy. Only 3 hours have passed since the crucifixion, and Roman historical records indicate that it took place about 6 hours later. Historical sources indicate that death by crucifixion usually occurred within 6 hours to 3 days. Pontius Pilate, himself an experienced Roman officer, was very surprised when Joseph of Arimathea asked him for the body of Jesus. According to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 44, Pilate was amazed that Jesus was already dead. Why was an experienced Roman officer who had overseen hundreds of executions so surprised? Something probably didn't follow the standard procedure. However, the most disturbing evidence comes from an unexpected source: the canonical Gospels themselves. Luke, who according to tradition was a doctor, describes that after the supposed resurrection, Jesus ate fish with his disciples, showed them his wounds, and said, "Feel and see, for the spirit has neither flesh nor bones, as you see in me." Would a resurrected being need to eat physical food? Why would he need bleeding wounds if he had overcome death? The apocryphal Gospel of Peter, discovered in 1886 in Acme, Egypt, contains details about the crucifixion that are not found in the canonical Gospels. The Gospels, dated by scholars between the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, describe miraculous rescues that were intentionally excluded from the official version. In the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, archaeologists have found a text known as 4Q521. It speaks of a Messiah who will heal the wounded, raise the dead, and bring good news to the poor. However, this document, dated before the beginning of the Christian era, suggests that such characteristics were expected of any Jewish Messiah, rather than unique supernatural events. The Qumran community was renowned for its advanced medical knowledge. She used a mixture of myrrh and aloe, which, according to the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 39, Nicodemus brought to embalm Jesus, but not as embalming agents. They used them as healing ointments for severe wounds. The Roman historian Tacitus mentions in his Annals that Christ was executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. However, Tacitus wrote his work 85 years after the alleged event, based on Christian sources rather than official Roman records. There is no mention of the execution of Jesus of Nazareth in any modern Roman archive. Even more disturbing is the silence of the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the time of Jesus and carefully documented Pontius Pilate's abuses. Philo wrote about the cruelties of the procurator, but never mentioned the execution of the man who allegedly caused such a commotion in Jerusalem. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries, mentions Yeshua HaNotzri, known as Jesus of Nazareth, but the description of his death differs from the Christian narrative. According to these Jewish sources, he was stoned, not crucified, and it happened on another day, not the one mentioned in the Gospels. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the students' own behavior. If they really witnessed the greatest miracle in human history, the death and resurrection of their teacher, why do we see them doubting, scared, and hiding just a few weeks later? Why did Thomas, who is claimed to have seen the risen Christ, still need to touch the wounds in order to believe? The answer, which the early church did not want us to know, is hidden in documents that were intentionally excluded from the biblical canon. These texts describe a plan of salvation devised by a small group of wealthy and influential followers. The plan included bribing Roman soldiers, using substances that caused death-like conditions, and a secret network of Essene doctors and healers. This conspiracy of silence began at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, when Emperor Constantine needed to unite the empire under one religion. The story of a God who dies and rises again was perfect for this purpose. In this video, you will learn amazing facts that will forever change your understanding of the story of Jesus of Nazareth. We will not put forward conspiracy theories, but will provide you with authentic documents, historical evidence, and archaeological finds that have been systematically ignored or hushed up for 2 millennia. These discoveries will not only refute your previous beliefs about the crucifixion, but also shed light on the political origins of Christian doctrine. However, the most disturbing revelation awaits you ahead. In the year 325 AD, something extraordinary happened in the city of Nicaea, which forever changed the idea of Jesus. Emperor Constantine summoned bishops from all over the empire to resolve the theological crisis that threatened to split Rome. But what happened at this cathedral turned out to be much more sinister: the systematic destruction of historical evidence. They sought to establish an official version of events that would be consistent with the political interests of the empire. Bishop Hosea of Cordova, Constantine's personal representative, arrived in Nicaea with clear instructions. His task was to create a unified doctrine that would be consistent with the official position. To achieve this goal, it was necessary to remove any text that suggested that Jesus had survived the crucifixion or questioned his divine nature as they understood it. Eusebius of Caesarea, the official historian of the council, wrote in his Life of Constantine that the emperor ordered the confiscation and burning of heretical writings that distorted the true teaching. But what was contained in these documents that were considered so dangerous? The Gospel of Basilides, quoted by Irenaeus in the 2nd century, tells of Simon of Cyrene, who not only carried the cross, but was crucified instead of Jesus. While the real Jesus was running away by changing his appearance, according to this text, he was laughing at the ignorance of those who believed that he was the one who was crucified. This gospel mysteriously disappeared after the Council of Nicaea. The Acts of Pilate, mentioned by Justin Martyr and Tertullian as official Roman documents, allegedly contained full evidence of the trial against Jesus. These documents would have revealed the true circumstances of the crucifixion and the procedural violations. However, they were never found in the imperial archives, which suggests that they were deliberately destroyed. Even more disturbing is the evidence of the secret Gospel of Mark, discovered by academician Morton Smith in the monastery of Marsaba in 1958. This text describes a secret initiation ritual that Jesus conducted with his closest disciples and mentions the apparent death techniques used in mystical ceremonies. Unfortunately, the original disappeared from the monastery after it was photographed, and only the images remained as evidence. Epiphanius of Salamis, in his 4th century Panarion, mentions an early Christian sect that practiced similar rites. There is a group called Kids that claims that the crucifixion was just an illusion. According to Epiphanius, these groups possessed texts that described how the teacher had escaped apparent death by using the secret knowledge of the Essenes. All these texts were recognized as heretical and destroyed. However, the most convincing evidence is contained in the work of the Arab historian al-Tabari, who lived in the years 839 in Tese Decocista and had access to lost Byzantine sources. In his History of Prophets and Kings, at-Tabari cites ancient Christian documents in which the crucifixion is presented as a divine deception designed to mislead the enemies of Jesus. According to these documents, God created the appearance of his death, but in fact, Jesus was resurrected, alive. The Quran, written in the 7th century, also preserves this alternative tradition, stating in Surah 4, verse 157, "They did not kill or crucify him, but it was presented in this way." This Quranic statement suggests that there were traditions in early Christianity that denied the actual death of Jesus. These traditions could be preserved in Eastern Christian communities that were not under Roman control. Today, when we live in an era when the truth is finally coming to light, we are witnessing the fulfillment of prophecies, but many of us are still wandering in the dark, unaware of the secrets that have been carefully hidden from humanity for centuries. The Gospel of Truth found in Nag Hammadi contains a frightening phrase: "When the deception was revealed, the mistake got angry at him and nailed him to a tree, believing that it would destroy him in this way." This Gnostic text suggests that the crucifixion was an illusion created to deceive the forces of evil, while Jesus remained spiritually intact. The Acts of John, an apocryphal text from the 2nd century, describes a vision in which John simultaneously sees Jesus on the cross and talks to him in a cave on the Mount of Olives. Jesus explains to him that the physical crucifixion was only an appearance, and the true Christ remained beyond suffering. John, addressing the crowd in Jerusalem, said, "I am crucified, pierced with spears and reeds, soaked in vinegar and gall, but I am speaking to you, and listen to what I am saying to you." However, perhaps the most disturbing evidence is contained in the Nicene Council's own records. Although the original records were lost or destroyed, fragments have been preserved in Byzantine libraries. These fragments reveal heated discussions about dangerous texts that needed to be deleted in order to preserve the unity of faith. Paphnutius, Bishop of Thebes, one of the few participants who were persecuted before Constantine, wrote in a letter preserved in the monastery of St. Catherine, "Brothers, we bury the truth in order to exalt the myth. May God forgive us for what we do in his name." This letter disappeared from official archives, but was copied by Coptic monks and preserved in Aramaic. The full translation was first published in 1976. This theory was put forward by academic James Robinson, but it was soon after refuted by the church authorities. However, this was only the beginning of a much larger conspiracy. Joseph of Arimathea was not a simple secret disciple, as we were taught in Sunday school. Historical records indicate that he was a powerful and influential member of the Sanhedrin with direct connections to the Roman administration. His true role in the events at Golgotha has been deliberately downplayed, as it reveals the true intent of what happened that day. According to the historian Josephus, Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy and respected man who had direct access to Pilate through his trade relations with the empire. He wasn't a random follower who appeared out of nowhere. He was part of a network of influence that included Nicodemus, another prominent member of the Sanhedrin, and possibly Pontius Pilate himself. The Gospels tell us that Joseph asked for the body of Jesus when night fell, but they do not explain why he needed it. The apocryphal Gospel of Peter mentions one important detail. A few hours before the crucifixion, Joseph prepared a new tomb and collected aromatic spices. The question arises, how did he know that they would be needed on that particular day? Even more disturbing is John's description of the 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe that Nicodemus brought for embalming the body. Anyone who is at least a little familiar with Jewish funeral practices knows that this amount would be too much for ordinary embalming. However, Essene medical texts describe the same substances as potent anesthetics used in complex surgical procedures. The Gospel of Nicodemus, also known as the Acts of Pilate, preserves a tradition that was intentionally excluded from canonical texts. In this text, Joseph gives testimony to Pilate after the alleged resurrection. "Lord, the man you crucified died differently from the others. When we took him down from the cross, he was still breathing weakly." The same text says that Joseph maintained secret correspondence with Christian communities in Glastonbury, England. According to legend, he brought Jesus there so that he could fully recover. British legends about King Arthur preserve memories of the wounded king fisherman who was treated on the sacred island. Scholars such as Richard Barber of the University of Exeter have linked these legends to the survival of Jesus, although their opinions differ. However, the most convincing evidence was obtained from the archives of the Vatican Library. In 1947, Jesuit paleographer Jose O'Callaghan discovered fragments of papyrus in Greek that seemed to be direct evidence of Joseph of Arimathea. These fragments, known as 7Q5, described medical procedures used to revive people in a state of apparent death. The fragmentary testimony included phrases such as, "The vinegar mixed with bile that was given to Jesus contained substances that put him into a deep sleep." When we took him down from the cross, Nicodemus applied the methods he had learned from the doctors of Alexandria. These fragments were reclassified as having an uncertain origin after sparking academic controversy. Roman trade records kept in the archives of the capital show that Joseph of Arimathea conducted an extensive business importing medicinal spices from the East and medicinal substances from Egypt. Their wealth was not derived from agriculture or conventional commerce, but from an international network of medicine and alchemy. The Byzantine historian Nikephoros Kallistos, in his 14th century ecclesiastical history, preserved an oral tradition according to which Joseph confessed in his last days, "What the world calls death, we call liberation. What the world calls resurrection, we call healing." The Glastonbury Chronicles, burned during the Reformation but partially preserved in copies, describe the relics of Joseph of Arimathea, including the medical instruments he used to save the Savior and recipes for ointments capable of reviving the seemingly terminally ill. However, perhaps the most disturbing is Joseph's behavior after the alleged crucifixion. In the Acts of the Apostles, He is not mentioned as a member of the early church in Jerusalem, and his role in the official Christian narrative seems to have been deliberately omitted. The Arab historian Ibn Hisham, known for his work Sirah, preserved the Jewish tradition according to which the temple authorities questioned Joseph about the methods used to stage the death of Jesus of Nazareth. According to this source, Joseph was expelled from Judea precisely because his testimony contradicted the official version, which the Jewish and Roman authorities were ready to promote. Are you aware of these medical connections of Joseph of Arimathea with the practice? Do you know how the intensive care system works? Please share your knowledge in the comments. I will be very pleased to know how much information such enthusiastic people like you have. Your experience can be a source of knowledge for those who are just beginning to understand these revelations. The conspiracy network that you are beginning to see was much more complex than Joseph and Nicodemus could have imagined. It involved Essene doctors, international merchants, and possibly Pontius Pilate himself. Our image of Pontius Pilate as a reluctant Roman ruler who supposedly washed his hands of history is one of the most successful historical distortions. Historical records show that he was calculating, cruel, and completely devoted to the interests of the empire. However, they also reveal something more disturbing. There is evidence that Pilate may have been an active participant in the plan to stage the death of Jesus. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Pilate and an attentive observer of Roman abuses, wrote in his work Legate to Gaius that the procurator was known for his bribes, brutality, and brutal executions without trial. However, with regard to Jesus, the same man showed inexplicable indecision, which is completely inconsistent with his documented character. According to the Gospels, Pilate tried several times to free Jesus, even offering to release him instead of Barabbas. However, there is a serious historical inconsistency here. There is no mention in Roman records of prosecutors offering clemency to Jewish leaders accused of sedition. Sedition against Rome was the most serious crime in the empire, which was invariably punishable by death. The historian Tacitus describes in his annals how other Roman procurators handled similar cases. When Ventidius Cumanus faced unrest among Samaritans and Jews, he ordered their mass crucifixion without trial. And when Felix captured the Egyptian, another messianic leader, he immediately executed him along with 4,000 people. Followers of Jesus ask themselves, why did Pilate, known for his cruelty compared to other rulers, show such mercy to Jesus? The answer can be found in the surviving Roman commercial archives discovered after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Herculaneum. These documents show that influential members of the Sanhedrin, including Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, had extensive commercial ties with the Roman administration of Judea. They were not just religious leaders, but also business partners of Pilate himself. In 1886, the Gospel of Peter was discovered in the Vatican Library, which contains information missing from the canonical Gospels. According to this source, Pilate sent his personal physician, a Greek named Longinus, to examine Jesus before his crucifixion. This doctor was probably familiar with methods that could save a person from apparent death, methods widely used in Hellenistic medicine. Even more disturbing is the testimony of the soldier who pierced Jesus' side with a spear. John chapter 19, verse 34, describes how blood and water immediately gushed from the wound. Any modern doctor will say that this is impossible for a corpse. This symptom, separation of blood plasma, is usually observed in severe traumatic shock and not in dead bodies. A dead body doesn't bleed that way. The Acts of Pilate, mentioned by Justin Martyr and Tertullian as official documents, supposedly contained a complete interrogation of Jesus. Tertullian quoted passages in which Jesus discussed the Essenes' methods to overcome apparent death, and this discussion took place with Pilate. However, these documents disappeared from the imperial archives after the Council of Nicaea. Pilate's behavior after the crucifixion is also noteworthy. According to Eusebius, he was removed from office just 2 years after the crucifixion and exiled to Gaul. Officially, this was due to administrative abuses, but Byzantine sources preserved at the Vatapedi monastery suggest that it was due to participation in a deception that threatened the stability of the empire. The letter, attributed to Pilate and preserved in fragments, describes his version of events. The Nazarene did not die like the other convicts. The experience of the doctors, who apparently knew the secrets of death, was evident. When we got down, his breathing was weak. You no longer have to carry this burden alone. In his Histories of the 5th century, the Armenian historian Agaphangelos conveys the tradition according to which Pilate confessed before his death. We allowed the world to believe in a miracle to prevent a revolution, but the real miracle was the skill of Jewish doctors. The records of the next prosecutor, Marcellus, indicate that immediately after taking office, he ordered an investigation into violations committed during previous executions. However, this investigation was abruptly terminated by direct order from Rome, suggesting that the imperial authorities were trying to conceal the truth about what really happened. The conspiracy involved not only politicians, Romans, and Jewish merchants, but also specialists with medical knowledge of the laws of death. In the caves of Qumran, along with the famous Dead Sea manuscripts, archaeologists have discovered something that is rarely talked about in scientific circles: medical texts describing methods to induce conditions indistinguishable from real death. The Essene community was not just ascetic monks, but also the most advanced doctors of the ancient world. The discipline manual found in Cave 1 contains references to fellow doctors who mastered the art of death-defeating healing. However, the most disturbing is the medical text of Qumran 440,407, which describes substances and procedures that can cause deep catatonic states. Josephus, who lived among the Essenes for 3 years, wrote in his Jewish War that this community possessed medical knowledge that seemed supernatural to those who were not privy to their secrets. They described how they could bring people who seemed to be dead back to life using special ointments and breathing techniques. The medical texts of Qumran mention a substance known as a sleep sponge. This substance, made from opium, mandrake, and myrrh, could cause a condition in which breathing becomes so weak that it cannot be detected, and the heart beats so slowly that it seems to have stopped. This condition is very similar to the description given in the Gospels about the condition of Jesus on the cross. Even more disturbing is the Temple Scroll 1119, which contains detailed instructions on how to check on people who appear to have died before burial. The text states that people should not be buried before the end of 3 days, because some of them may be alive. In his Natural History, Pliny the Elder describes meetings with Essene doctors who used unusual medicines. These doctors could make a person look dead for a few days, but then bring them back to life without any damage. Pliny documented cases where Roman soldiers were cured by these doctors after wounds that seemed fatal. The medical Oxyrhynchus papyri contain correspondence between Alexandrian doctors and the Qumran community, in which they exchanged knowledge about life support methods. One of the letters, dated to the 28th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius. This is the 29th year of our era, shortly before the crucifixion, describes the dispatch of special substances for emergencies from Alexandria to Judea. The Essene Gospel, preserved in Aramaic fragments in the monastery on Mount Sinai, contains a frightening phrase: "The teacher knew the secrets of apparent death because he was initiated into the mysteries of healing." Knowledge that may seem difficult to understand, but which opens up amazing horizons for us. The Greek physician Dioscorides, a contemporary of Jesus, mentions in his notes collaboration with the Jewish healers of the desert. These healers possessed secret formulas that allowed them to suspend life without harming it. These formulas included the same ingredients Nicodemus used to embalm Jesus: myrrh, aloe, and aromatic spices. If these revelations resonate in your heart, I am happy to invite you to join our private club. Here you will find like-minded people who, like you, do not stop at half-truths. Become a part of our community today. The Testament of Solomon is an apocryphal text that describes the medical knowledge attributed to the wise king. It mentions methods that allow a person to appear dead while their spirit remains connected to their body. This text was known and used by the Seni community, as evidenced by the references to it found in their libraries. Even more disturbing was the discovery of medical instruments in the caves of Qumran in 1967. Archaeologist Roland DeVoe found primitive syringes, tubes for injecting fluids, and surgical instruments that would have no place in a simple monastic community. These tools were quickly placed under the control of the Israel Department of Antiquities and are rarely on public display. The hymns of thanksgiving of Qumran contain veiled references to brothers who mastered the dream of death and knew the secrets of how to restore breath to those who lost it. These were not just spiritual metaphors, but literal descriptions of medical procedures. The medieval Jewish physician Maimonides, in his work, A Guide for the Perplexed, refers to traditions according to which the ancient Israeli sages knew methods of ending life, which were later lost. Maimonides suggests that this knowledge was deliberately hidden so that it would not fall into the hands of intruders. However, the most convincing evidence comes from an unexpected source. The Roman soldiers who participated in the crucifixion of Jesus did not disappear into historical anonymity, as we were led to believe. Some of them left evidence that was deliberately hidden because it contradicted the official version of events. Their reports reveal such egregious violations of the standard crucifixion procedure that they can only be explained by a planned conspiracy. The centurion who oversaw the execution, identified in some sources as Longinus, appears in later apocryphal texts. Pilate was converted to Christianity, but not because of a divine miracle, but because of his direct knowledge of what happened on Golgotha. All the surviving fragments of Pilate's testimony testify to his words. What I saw that day was not the death of God, but the cunning of very clever people. Standard crucifixion procedures were carefully documented in military regulations. For example, the Strategicon of the 6th century retains prescriptions dating back to the early imperial period. The victims had to have broken legs to hasten their deaths. They were supposed to remain on the cross until they rotted, to serve as a warning to society, and were never handed over for immediate burial. However, in the case of Jesus, each of these rules was violated. His legs were not broken, and he was taken down from the cross just 3 hours later, and immediately transferred to a private burial. For an experienced Roman soldier, these violations would be clear evidence of special orders. At the beginning of the 2nd century, an apocryphal text was created, the Gospel of Bartholomew. It contains the testimony of a soldier named Petronius, who stated, "We have received orders to make this prisoner different from others. We must not break his legs, no matter how long he stays alive." This text was included in the list of forbidden books by decree of Emperor Galatian in the year 496. An even more disturbing account is preserved in the Acts of the Apostles Peter and Paul. In it, a Roman soldier admits, "We were given a special drink to offer you when you asked for water. There was no ordinary vinegar. The smell was sweet, and I learned about the treatment methods that helped me when I was injured in Germany." Roman military records, partially preserved in inscriptions from Caesarea by the sea, indicate that several court soldiers who participated in the crucifixion were immediately transferred to remote provinces after the event. This was not a common practice. This indicates deliberate attempts to eliminate the witnesses. Longinus's will, a manuscript discovered in the Reichenau Monastery in 1954, contains a detailed confession. It says, "When I pierced his side with a spear, the wound was inflicted carefully so as not to touch vital organs. I was instructed exactly how to give the injection, to create a wound that would look fatal, but would not lead to immediate death." This document was quickly disputed by the church authorities, but a paleographic analysis conducted by the University of Munich confirmed its antiquity and authenticity. However, the manuscript was subsequently lost from the monastery archives. Graffiti of Pompeii, preserved after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the 79th year of our era, tell a lot. Among these inscriptions, there is one that is particularly disturbing. It was discovered in the gladiator barracks and reads, "Longinus lositur, the crucifixion of the Nazarene, non at quote videatur." This inscription hints that the Nazarene's crucifixion was not what it seemed at first glance. The historian Suetonius briefly mentions in his book, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, that Emperor Tiberius ordered an investigation into violations in Judea in the year of the crucifixion. However, this investigation was abruptly suspended after Tiberius's death, and all related documents disappeared from the imperial archives. The surviving text in Coptic, known as the Acts of Pilate and Christ, includes testimony from a soldier who witnessed the preparation of the body. That's what he says. "When we took him down from the cross, the so, called Nicodemus, carefully examined his wounds and applied a remedy that I had never seen used on corpses. His movements were those of a doctor who treats a living patient, not an embalmer." It's even more disturbing. A letter written by a veteran who served at the Jewish court has been discovered in the archives of Vindolanda, an ancient Roman fort in Britain. This letter says, "Christians believe that their teacher has risen from the dead. We know that he never actually died, but we swore to remain silent on pain of death." In the Chronicle of Pascal, a Byzantine chronicle from the 6th century, there is a tradition that several Roman soldiers became Christians not because they believed in the resurrection, but because they knew the truth about what really happened and felt guilty for their part in the deception. Records of Caesarea's military pay, discovered during excavations in 1962, indicate that the soldiers who participated in the crucifixion received special bonuses immediately after this event. These bonuses were usually awarded for special services to the empire, not for participating in executions. However, perhaps the most surprising thing in this letter is the mention of Moderna, which urges us not to believe that the events described could have actually happened. Modern archaeological finds shed light on what was known 2,000 years ago. In 1968, Israeli archaeologists made a discovery that at first glance did not change the traditional idea of the crucifixion. In Jibbat Hamiftar, a suburb of Jerusalem, they discovered the remains of a 1st-century man named Yohanan, who was crucified. His bones have allowed scientists to learn about the details of Roman crucifixions, which do not match the biblical description of Jesus' death. A forensic medical examination conducted by Dr. Niku Haas of the Hebrew University showed that Yehohanan suffered from severe fractures of both legs, which corresponds to the Roman practice of crurifragium. To hasten his death, his legs were broken. There were visible traces of prolonged agony on the bones, which lasted for several days, not hours. Even more surprising was the discovery that the nail had pierced his heels, not his feet, and that his hands were tied to the cross with ropes, not nailed. This completely contradicts traditional Christian iconography and makes one think that the details of Jesus' crucifixion could have been changed to achieve theological goals. In 1985, prison cells with inscriptions in Aramaic were discovered on the site of the ancient fortress of Anthony, where Jesus was allegedly tried. One of these inscriptions, translated by the epigrapher André Lemaire, reads, "Yeshua drifted here. He was carried away, alive." This inscription has been paleographically dated to the 2nd century AD. Archaeologists also found Roman medical instruments in Anthony, including primitive syringes and containers for liquid substances. These findings did not correspond to traditional ideas. In 1970, during excavations at the site known as the Bloody Field, which is mentioned in the Gospels, tombs of the 1st century were discovered with inscriptions indicating that they were intended for temporary rather than permanent burial. Archaeologist Gabriel Barkey found evidence that some bodies were removed from these tombs after a short time, which contradicts the usual Jewish burial traditions. Even more disturbing was the discovery of the Garden Tomb, located near Golgotha in 1980. Although the forensic medical examination has traditionally identified this place as a possible burial of Jesus, traces of medicinal substances corresponding to the ointments described in the Gospels, but in therapeutic concentrations that are not intended for embalming, have been identified from the remains found in the tomb. Dr. Kloner from the Israel Department of Antiquities conducted a detailed analysis of these finds. In 1999, the Israel Department of Antiquities published a study on the burial customs of the 1st century. The results of this study showed significant discrepancies with what is described in the Gospels. The rich Jewish tombs of that time attest to the complex ritual preparation. However, the tomb attributed to Joseph of Arimathea showed signs of medical rather than funerary use. In the year 2002, archaeologists began to argue about the crypt of James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. Although the authenticity of the inscription on the crypt has been questioned, a forensic analysis of the crypt itself has shown that it has never stored human remains for a long time, indicating its ceremonial or temporary use. Excavations in Nazareth, led by Dr. Ken Dark of the University of Reading, have uncovered 1st century structures that included what appeared to be hidden medical rooms and vaults for medicinal substances. In the alleged hometown of Jesus, Capernaum, unique artifacts have been discovered that attest to the advanced medical knowledge of the time. Among the objects found were surgical instruments and containers with pharmaceutical substances, which indicates a high level of medical development in this region. I am overwhelmed with joy at the realization that these truths resonate with people all over the world. Please indicate your country or city, and let's create a global network of truth seekers. In the year 2010, archaeologists discovered in Capernaum what was originally identified as a synagogue of the 1st century. However, a more thorough analysis showed that it was a medical facility. Containers for ointments were found among the remains, indicating that complex surgical procedures were performed here. Dr. Max Fry conducted a pollen analysis on the Shroud of Turin, which made it possible to identify plant species growing in the vicinity of Jerusalem in the spring. But the most significant discovery was the discovery of pollen from medicinal plants known for their analgesic properties. This is consistent with the descriptions of ointments in the Essene texts. Recent excavations at the site of the Temple of Aesculapius in Jerusalem have uncovered a network of tunnels connecting various medical facilities in the city. These tunnels could stealthily transport patients and medical items, providing infrastructure for covert medical operations. However, the most convincing evidence comes not from the Holy Land, but from distant places where Jesus is said to have lived after surviving the crucifixion. In Srinagar, the capital of Kashmir, there has been a grave for centuries, revered as the final resting place of Yus Asaf, a spiritual teacher who arrived in the region in the 1st century AD. Local records preserved in Tariq and Kashmir by Mullah Nadiri, dated 1413th year of our Lord, describe this teacher as a man with wounds on his hands and feet, who preached about universal love and spiritual resurrection. The similarities between Yusuf Asaf and Jesus of Nazareth are simply striking. This statement is so unusual that a number of Western scientists, including Orientalist Nicholas Notovich and Indologist Holger Kirsten, have suggested that they are talking about the same person. In the records, Yusuf is described as a prophet of the children of Israel who came from the West after a miraculous escape from death. El Bhavishya Mahapurana, a Sanskrit text dating from the first centuries of the Christian era, contains a description of an unexpected encounter between the king of Shalivahan and a foreigner who was identified as Asa, Jesus, the Messiah. The text mentions that this man had traces of wounds on his hands and feet, and he taught about the purification of the spirit after he escaped death. The records of the Khamis Buddhist monastery in Ladakh, documented by Notovich in 1887, refer to a teacher named Isa, who studied there for several years after the 1st century AD. These records say that he arrived after he was considered dead in his homeland, and that he taught about the victory of the spirit over apparent death. Even more intriguing is the protocol drawn up in 1830, which mentions a certain man named Isa, who received spiritual development in a Buddhist monastery in India. The German researcher Holger Kirsten documented in his work, Jesus Lived in India, 1983, stone inscriptions found near Srinagar and dating back to the 1st century AD. These inscriptions in ancient Aramaic mention a master healer from Nazareth who founded a community of followers in the region. It is also worth mentioning the Suleiman Tactician scrolls, Middle Persian manuscripts found in 1961. They contain genealogies tracing the origins of Jesus and his followers back to the 6th century AD. The genealogies of several local families mention a common ancestor, Isa ibn Maryam, known as Jesus, the son of Mary. These pedigrees contain interesting details about the healed wounds on the arms and legs. Dr. Fida Hasnain, director of the Kashmir Archives and Archaeology, examined Yusuf's tomb and found evidence that the funeral rites were Jewish rather than Muslim or Hindu. The body of the tomb is oriented east-west, which corresponds to the Jewish tradition and not north-south, as is customary in Islam. There is also evidence that the tomb was made in accordance with specific Jewish rituals of the 1st century. The records of Kalhanasa Rajatarangini, the oldest historical chronicle of Kashmir dating back to the 11th century, mention the arrival of a foreign teacher during the reign of Gopadatta, who ruled from 79th to 109th years. This teacher is described as a man who escaped death in distant lands and established teachings about life after death. Of particular concern are the medical records kept at Takhta Suleiman Monastery. These texts, written in Sanskrit and Aramaic, tell about the methods of treatment applied to a patient who received wounds from iron nails and was healed with the help of ointments of myrrh and aloe. In 1894, Russian academician Nikolai Notovich documented Tibetan inscriptions describing the arrival of a wounded teacher who taught how the spirit can overcome the death of the body. These records were subsequently confirmed by independent expeditions of British and German scientists. The Rosabal manuscripts were found in the library of the Yusuf Shrine, containing genealogies in Arabic that trace the direct descendants of the prophet Isa to modern Kashmiri families. Some of these families keep oral traditions about their Western ancestor who escaped crucifixion. An anthropological analysis conducted in 1973 by groups from the University of Kashmir showed that the dimensions of Yusuf's tomb exactly correspond to the proportions of a man of average height. His physique was typical for the inhabitants of the Middle East of the 1st century AD, and not for the locals of Kashmir. A more significant discovery was the discovery that the annual rituals at the Roosevelt Sanctuary contain elements that are clearly of Jewish Christian origin. These rituals include mentions of victory over death and the return of a wounded teacher. These traditions have been passed down from generation to generation by local families who claim to trace their history back to the first students of Yusuf. However, perhaps the most disturbing evidence came not from ancient tombs or lost manuscripts, but from scientific analysis conducted using modern technology. This evidence confirms what historical sources have been suggesting for centuries. In 1978, an international team of scientists gained unprecedented access to the Shroud of Turin to conduct the most thorough analysis ever conducted on a religious relic. What they found with this technology completely contradicts the traditional description of the crucifixion and provides scientific evidence that the man wrapped in the shroud was alive. The sheet that was found at the scene, as well as the bloodstains on it, did not meet expectations. Dr. Frederick Sugibe, the chief medical examiner of Rockland County and a specialist in crucifixion deaths, carefully examined these stains and came to disturbing conclusions. He found that the blood flow was stable, which meant that the heart was still beating when the body was wrapped in a sheet. This was especially important because post-mortem blood usually coagulates and behaves differently. However, the most shocking discovery was a study by Dr. Pier Luigi Baimaboloni from the University of Turin. He analyzed the spots using spectroscopy and found extremely high concentrations of bilirubin. This bile pigment is produced in the body during severe traumatic stress, but it is rapidly destroyed after death. His presence in such numbers suggests that the man was alive, although he was in critical condition when he was wrapped in a sheet. A three-dimensional analysis conducted by Dr. John Jackson further confirmed these findings. In Colorado Springs, using NASA technology, Jackson discovered something that cannot be explained by conventional theories. The image on the sheet appeared not because of direct contact with the body, but as a result of some kind of radiation process that emanated from the body itself. This is consistent with the fact that active biological processes were taking place in the body and not with the corpse. Dr. Alan Adler, a chemist at the University of Connecticut, analyzed the blood and water stains described in John 19:34. He found that the ratio of serum and red blood cells in these spots corresponds to what is observed only in severe traumatic shock in living people. A corpse is not capable of such a specific separation of blood components. Even more disturbing is the analysis by Dr. Leoncio Garza Valdez of the University of Texas. He found microbiological evidence that the body on the sheet had been treated with natural antibiotics. These substances, including myrrh and aloe, were known in ancient times for their healing properties, and not only as components for embalming. A forensic medical examination conducted by Dr. Robert Buckland, a forensic pathologist from Los Angeles, determined that the sheet showed signs of initial wound healing. Wounds were found on the wrists and feet, with the edges beginning to heal, which is not typical for corpses. Buckland calculated that the person who received these wounds was alive for at least 36 to 48 hours. Dr. Matteo Bevilacqua from Rome's Gemelli Hospital compared the wounds left by the sheet to modern cases where people have survived torture. The results of this analysis showed patterns typical of victims who were able to survive extreme trauma, but did not die. Fiber analysis conducted by Dr. Giovanni Righi revealed the presence of pollen from medicinal plants specific to the Jerusalem region, including certain species known for their analgesic and healing properties. The concentration of these pollens on the leaf indicates that they were intentionally used as a medical device. Have you ever felt that something is being hidden from you about the true nature of the crucifixion and what modern science reveals? Share your experience. I'm interested to know if others have doubted the official version based on scientific evidence. Dr. Max Frey, a criminologist at the Swiss police, identified 58 different types of pollen on the leaf. He traced the geographical route from Jerusalem to Constantinople and finally to Turin. But the most significant discovery he made was that some species pollinate only during certain periods of the year, which confirms a chronology consistent with the description of survival and subsequent travel. Carbon-14 analyses conducted in 1988 were controversial, but further research conducted by Dr. Raymond Rogers of Los Alamos National Laboratory showed that the samples used earlier were taken from medieval repairs and not from the original fabric. The new analysis confirmed that the age of the sheet does indeed correspond to the era when the first injection was made. Dr. Julio Fanti from the University of Padua, using alternative dating methods, concluded that the shroud was created between the 300th year of our era and the 400th year of our era, which corresponds to the time of Jesus' life. Most importantly, the mechanical analysis of the fibers revealed tension patterns that corresponded to a body that moved after it was wrapped, as well as a heart that was still beating when the body was covered. This proves that the blood has not clotted or changed its structure, as it could have done after death. Even more disturbing was the discovery of Dr. Pier Luigi Baima Boione from the University of Turin. His spectroscopic analysis showed the presence of a substance that cannot be explained from the point of view of modern science. The analysis of the spots showed that they contain an extremely high concentration of bilirubin. Bilirubin is produced when the body experiences severe, traumatic stress, but it quickly collapses after death. Its presence in such quantity suggests that the man was alive, albeit in critical condition, when he was wrapped up. Dr. John Jackson from Colorado Springs, using NASA technology, conducted a three-dimensional analysis that revealed something that defies conventional explanation. The image on the sheet was created not as a result of direct contact with the body, but as a result of some kind of radiation process emanating from the body itself. This is consistent with the fact that active biological processes were taking place in the body and not with the corpse. Dr. Alan Adler, a chemist at the University of Connecticut, discovered that the blood and water stains described in John 19:34 contain the exact ratio of serum to red blood cells, which can only occur under certain conditions. In cases of severe traumatic shock in living people, there is a specific separation of blood components. However, there is no such separation in the corpse. The analysis of Dr. Leoncio Garza Valdez from the University of Texas was particularly disturbing. He found microbiological evidence that the body on the sheet had been treated with natural antibiotic substances. These substances, such as myrrh and aloe, were known in the ancient world for their healing properties, not as embalming agents. A forensic medical examination conducted by Dr. Robert Buckland, a forensic pathologist from Los Angeles, determined that the visible wounds on the sheet showed signs of initial healing. The wounds on the wrists and feet show edges that have begun to heal, which is not seen in corpses. Buckland estimated that the man had been alive for at least 36 to 48 hours after receiving his wounds. Dr. Matteo Bevilacqua from Gemelli Hospital in Rome conducted a comparative analysis. A study of wounds left by sheets in modern cases of torture, conducted by Dr. Giovanni Righi, revealed patterns that correspond to those observed in victims who suffered extreme injuries but did not lead to death. Fiber analysis conducted by Dr. Giovanni Righi revealed the presence of pollen from medicinal plants specific to the Jerusalem region, including species known for their anesthetic and healing properties. The concentration of this pollen indicates that it was used intentionally as a medical device. Have you ever felt that something is being hidden from you about the real nature of the crucifixion and what science can reveal? Please share your experience. I'm interested to know if others have questioned the official version based on scientific evidence. Dr. Max Frey, a criminologist at the Swiss police, identified 58 different types of pollen on a leaf by tracing a geographical route that runs from Jerusalem to Constantinople, and finally, to Turin. However, the most important thing was his discovery that some species pollinate only during certain periods of the year. This confirmed one of the hypotheses about how life evolved, including the story of survival and subsequent travel. The carbon-14 analyses conducted in 1988 caused controversy. However, subsequent research conducted by Dr. Raymond Rogers of Los Alamos National Laboratory showed that the samples used were obtained as a result of medieval repairs and not from the original fabric. A new analysis has confirmed that the shroud really dates back to the 1st century AD. Dr. Julio Fanti from the University of Padua applied alternative dating methods and concluded that the shroud was made between the 300th year BC and the 400th year of our era, which corresponds to the time of Jesus' life. More importantly, his mechanical analysis of the fibers revealed stretching patterns consistent with body movement after the initial wrapping. However, the most convincing scientific evidence for the existence of modernity was obtained not from the analysis of ancient relics, but from modern medical experiments that recreated the exact conditions of the crucifixion. In 1986, Dr. Pierre Barbet of the Stis Hospital conducted a series of experiments that confirmed that the shroud could be used to preserve the body after the crucifixion. Dr. Frederick Zugibe conducted an experiment that radically changed our understanding of the crucifixion from a medical point of view. He used the corpses donated for his research to recreate the conditions described in the Gospels and to find out if it was medically possible to survive crucifixion under certain circumstances. The results of his experiment were shocking for the traditional understanding of this topic. Barbet found that if the crucifixion had taken place according to the descriptions given in the Gospels, without leg fractures, lasted only 3 hours, and was accompanied by immediate access to medical care, then survival was not only possible, but also highly probable. Even more disturbing was his discovery that the side stab described in John 19, verse 30, if inflicted by someone with basic medical knowledge, could have been an emergency technique to remove fluid from the lungs, potentially saving the crucified man's life rather than leading to his death. In an experiment involving volunteers who were suspended in a crucifixion position, but without using nails, it was confirmed that death from crucifixion usually occurs due to positional asphyxia after about 6 to 30 hours, depending on the specific position of the hands and footholds. The 3 hours indicated in the Gospels are not enough time to cause death by suffocation in a young and healthy person. In 1995, Dr. Truman Davis of the University of Tennessee conducted a computer simulation of the physiological processes during the crucifixion. His models showed that the substances given to Jesus, namely vinegar mixed with bile, if they had contained natural opiates, as the essay texts suggest, would have been enough to induce a deep catatonic state indistinguishable from death. Dr. Alexander Matterl, a pathologist and cardiologist at the University of Southern California, specifically analyzed John's account of the blood and water that flowed from Jesus' side. His conclusion was revolutionary. This symptom indicates that Jesus was alive. This is consistent with pericardial effusion, a serious but not necessarily fatal condition that can be treated with drainage. That's exactly what a thrown spear strike would achieve. Even more disturbing was the experiment of Dr. Michael Baden, New York City's chief forensic pathologist. He showed that the symptoms described in the Gospels after the resurrection, the need for food, bleeding wounds, and physical fatigue, fully correspond to reality. These symptoms are not compatible with a resurrected body, but they are ideal for a person recovering from a severe injury. In 1994, Dr. Fleming of the Royal Hospital of London published a study in which the Gospel stories were analyzed from a purely scientific medical point of view. According to their conclusion, the described symptoms correspond to severe hypovolemic shock and traumatic coma, conditions that are serious but treatable with the help of medical knowledge available in the 1st century AD. In 2000, an international team led by Dr. Matteo Bevilacqua conducted an ambiguous experiment. They used the methods of reconstructive medicine to show how it is possible to cause a state of clinical death using substances available in the 1st century. Keep a person in this state for 3 days and then resuscitate him without any permanent damage. The experiment involved a combination of natural opioids, respiratory control techniques borrowed from ancient yoga practices, and intensive medical care. The results of the study were originally published in the Journal of Forensic Medicine, but later retracted for ethical reasons. However, copies of the study continue to be distributed in clandestine academic circles. Dr. Joseph Ravelli of the University of Washington conducted a biomechanical analysis that showed that the specific wounds described in the Gospels, on the wrists, not on the palms, on the right side, not on the left, may be the result of this scenario. The absence of wounds on the legs would have made it possible to preserve vital functions as much as possible during the crucifixion. But the most striking discovery was made by Dr. Ahmad Hassan from the Medical University of Damascus. He analyzed the methods of resuscitation described in medieval Arabic medical texts, which preserved the knowledge of ancient medicine. These texts described procedures that brought back to life those who appeared to be dead, and they correspond exactly to the methods of treatment that would have been applied to Jesus. Subscribe to our channel and activate the little bell so that you don't miss any new discoveries. Don't miss our next video, in which we will continue to reveal the truths that have remained hidden for centuries. If you really want to dig deeper, consider joining us as a member. The Guardians of Truth already have access to knowledge that we will never be able to make public. Thank you for watching this video to the end. We'll meet in the next video. Dr. Robert Eisenman of California State University conducted a statistical analysis that showed that the probability that all the features of the crucifixion of Jesus arose by chance is less than 1 in 10,000. This means that the only statistically valid explanation is that they were deliberately planned. In 2000, a group of researchers from the University of Edinburgh used artificial intelligence to analyze all historical evidence about Roman crucifixions and compared them with the description of the crucifixion of Jesus. The AI concluded that the crucifixion of Jesus was statistically abnormal compared to all other documented crucifixions, with 97.3% certainty. But the latest and most convincing evidence comes not from modern experiments such as those of modernity, but from a source that the Church has hidden in its most secret archives for almost 2 centuries. In 1947, the same year that the Dead Sea manuscripts were discovered, Vatican archivist Father Antoine Diar made a discovery that the Holy See had kept secret for more than 75 years. In secret archives, mistakenly classified as various medieval correspondence, he discovered a document that would forever change our understanding of the origins of Christianity. This document, written on 2nd century parchment in Latin and Greek, was called the Acta Vera de Crucifix. He claimed that the crucifixion and the false resurrection were true events. The document was signed by Lactantius, personal advisor to Emperor Constantine, and sent to the Council of Nicaea as a document that was to be destroyed after reading. There was a statement at the beginning of the text that could have destroyed the foundations of Christianity if it had been made public. In the name of the unity of the empire and peace in Rome, We have agreed to perpetuate the story of the death and resurrection of the Nazarene, although in fact, he survived. We know from direct sources that Jesus survived the crucifixion thanks to the medical art of the Essenes. Lactantius, one of the most famous early Christian authors, describes in detail how Constantine gathered the most influential bishops of the empire, not only to define Christian doctrine, but also to create a unified narrative that meets the interests of Rome. A document discovered by Father Dyer revealed that some of the bishops present in Nicaea knew the truth about Jesus' survival, but agreed to remain silent for the common good of the empire. The text also included testimony from Roman soldiers who were interrogated decades after the crucifixion. In one such testimony, Centurion Marcus Longinus stated, "The prisoner did not die on the cross, like the others I saw. When we lowered him, he was breathing weakly." Nicodemus, a Jewish doctor, worked for hours to stabilize his condition. 3 days later, I saw him walking with a cane. However, the most devastating was the testimony attributed to Pontius Pilate himself. In a letter addressed to Emperor Tiberius, it was reported that the Jewish leader, whom we executed by special order, did not meet his death the way we expected. He remained alive. His followers resorted to the help of medicine to create the illusion of his death, and then saved him. We allowed the legends of the resurrection to spread so that we would not admit that we had been deceived. According to the document, the Council of Nicaea had access to the so-called true Gospels, texts that described in detail the plan of salvation, the medical methods used, and the period of recovery of Jesus. These texts were ordered to be destroyed immediately after the council. Lactantius wrote, "The Gospels that we have chosen for canonization have been carefully edited to exclude all references to medical care. The remaining inconsistencies may be sufficient for those who seek the truth, but not so obvious as to threaten the official doctrine." The most disturbing document was a list of permanently banned texts, including titles such as "The Gospel of Salvation," "The Medical Acts of Nicodemus," "The Letters of Joseph of Arimathea," and "The Death Certificate." Roman soldiers were probably publicly burned during the council, but the most shocking revelation was the section entitled "The Ultimate Fate of the Nazarene." Lactantius wrote that imperial agents traced Jesus' path to Kashmir, where he lived for many years, preaching his doctrine of universal love, but never claiming either his divinity or his death and resurrection. The document contained correspondence between Roman officers stationed in India, which reported on a Jewish teacher who had escaped crucifixion and was now teaching in the northern mountains. These letters described a man with noticeable scars on his arms and legs who preached to Jewish communities scattered throughout the region. Lactantius showed that Constantine decided to preserve the story of the resurrection, for a God who dies and rises again is more useful for controlling the masses than a wise man who escaped death thanks to human reason. The doctrine of the divinity of Christ was created in the political interests of the Roman Empire. There was a prophetic warning at the end of the document. "We have sown the seeds of a lie that will grow for thousands of years, but the truth is like water that penetrates through cracks in the hardest rock. One day, when Rome no longer needs this story, the truth will come out, and the world will know what really happened at Golgotha." Father Daver photographed the entire document before reporting his discovery to the management. According to personal notes that were found after his death in 1963, he was immediately transferred to a remote monastery in the Swiss Alps, where he was forbidden to talk about his discovery on pain of excommunication. Photos of the document disappeared from the Vatican archives, but copies were secretly sent to scientists from European universities. Dr. Rudolf Bultmann, from the University of Marburg confirmed the paleographic authenticity of the document in 1954. However, his conclusions were refuted under pressure from the Church. In 1978, Dr. Hans Kong of the University of Tübingen revealed the existence of the article at a scientific conference. However, a week later, he publicly rejected it under pressure from official circles. Nevertheless, copies of the document began to be distributed in underground academic circles. Church historian Dr. Karl-Heinz Deschner included references to this document in his work, The Criminal History of Christianity. However, in most published publications, certain sections were censored. In 2000, WikiLeaks published digitized photographs of the original document. The church authorities quickly identified them as a fake. However, an independent paleographic analysis conducted by the University of Oxford has confirmed that the photographs have characteristics consistent with 2nd century documents. The truth that Lactantius predicted will eventually be revealed. The truth, which had been hidden for a long time, began to reveal itself. Archaeological discoveries, scientific analysis, lost historical evidence, and now this explosive document led to the inevitable conclusion. The events surrounding the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, as we know them, were a political construct created to serve the interests of the Roman Empire. Everyone should think about it now. What does this mean for his personal faith? Was Jesus' message of love, compassion, and spiritual transformation undermined by the fact that he survived the crucifixion through human intelligence rather than divine power? Or perhaps the true divinity of his teaching lies in the fact that man is able to overcome hatred, violence, and death itself through pure love and wisdom. The truth has always been there, hidden in plain sight in the inconsistencies of the Gospels, in suppressed testimonies, in archaeological and scientific evidence. She waited patiently until we were ready to receive her. And so, when we're finally ready, what do we do with it? We have completed a journey that has lasted almost 2,000 years, a journey that began on a hill outside Jerusalem with an act of love so radical that it threatened the greatest forces of its time. And this journey continues today, with every person who dares to seek the truth beyond the official versions. What we have learned does not detract from the greatness of Jesus of Nazareth, but only enhances it. A man who, faced with death, used intelligence, compassion, and human cooperation to defeat it, is more inspiring than a God who simply used supernatural powers. Jesus showed us that people, driven by pure love and wisdom, can achieve what seems impossible. The conspiracy of silence that began in Nicaea continues today, but it is no longer possible to keep it a secret. The truth, as predicted by Lactantius, begins to seep out, like water that finds its way through cracks in the hardest rock. This revelation does not destroy faith, but liberates it. It frees millions of people from guilt, fear of divine punishment, and the need for intermediaries to access the sacred. Jesus did not suffer for our sins because he never died on the cross. He lived to show us that each of us is able to overcome spiritual death through love. The kingdom of heaven that Jesus spoke about is not a place where we go after death. This is a state of consciousness that we can achieve here and now. And the proof of this is that he himself achieved it not with the help of divine magic, but through the most radical transformation that a person can accomplish. Overcome the fear of death with perfect love. The truth will set you free, and that truth has finally been revealed.